Welcome, everybody, to Mythic Mission with Professor Michael Jahoski. And today I'm very pleased to announce that our lay ministry that we are launching from home because of the release of my book and a number of other reasons, kind of as an inspiration I'll talk about today for why my wife and I have decided to start this sort of online lay ministry. It's called Mythic Mission. If you know me and you're connected to me on social media, that's great. You already have access probably to my YouTube channel. But if you're new, please subscribe and also consider using the link, one of the links below that takes you to my WordPress site where I have a blog that you can stay in touch with when I do new videos and other things, other announcements, things that I'm doing, some essays or short devotions I might be doing in the future, and just for general updates about my book and things that I'm doing in the academic world. So I've got a website there. And on the website, as well as here on the YouTube channel, I have links to all the salient and recent reviews, interviews, podcasts, and other resources, especially if you're interested in getting my book, The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle-earth. There's a link to Amazon and Webfed stock there as well, and on my WordPress website where you can find my book. Well, I am not here to talk really specifically about my book today, although I'm going to be weaving in some of the arguments from my book, The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle-earth, at some point. But what I'm really interested in doing today is two things. I would like to introduce to you who I am and what Mythic Ministry, my Mythic Ministry through Mythic Mission is designed to do. And I'm going to talk a little bit about two really crucial and critical concepts, mythos, and that's an ancient Greek word, and the imagination. And so I'm going to be pulling up some notes here to go through with you here as I want to just introduce these concepts to you today. And I think you guys are going to enjoy it. And this is the sort of content that I'm going to be bringing. So that's a great segue into the purpose of the ministry, Mythic Mission. And then we'll get into mythos, and the imagination. So really, we started this because just in the last year, a month ago now, in December and in November, I think we started, no, maybe it was October. We started a few months back, I should say, a Zoom class that I was doing with family and friends for the most part, walking people through the release of my new book and kind of giving an overview. I've got some YouTube videos that are really far too long, and some of my videos are going to be longer, more academic. This one I'm hoping to keep a little briefer. So I'll have a mixture of different length of content, but we kind of had this idea that we would start sort of an online lay ministry that would be centered around some of the concepts in my book, which really are, can be summarized, I should say, in those two concepts, myth and imagination. Because my book is all about reaching people and reaching people with the gospel through the imagination, through the faculty of the imagination, and through mythos. And we're going to explain what those concepts are in a minute. And because of the interest some people had in the Zoom class, and because I really would like to develop this book into a ministry, helping equip Christians and, well, I should start with just Christians first. Christians really, I want to equip to be able to use literature appropriately and carefully to help people find the gospel within certain works of literature, and just more generally how literature can reflect and communicate the gospel. For non-Christians and people who are skeptical or non-believers, I would love to interest you in a new way through indirect communication to get to know the Christian worldview, to step inside the Christian sacramental vision of reality, and to kind of understand how we look at the world through especially the eyes of Christ, and how myth, which is a really kind of a freighted term with lots of erroneous meanings today, can be a vehicle for communicating indirectly communicating truth from the Christian point of view. So I hope it's a channel for everybody. All are welcome. Please post any comments if you have them, or any questions. Anytime I do videos, you're welcome to ask. Again, subscribe, and please consider checking out the other links that I have on the YouTube channel to get access to my website, reviews about my book, recent interviews. I've been very busy lately doing a lot of podcasts. So if you'd like a really deep dive on my book, I would recommend the most in-detail one was with Dr. Michael Heiser from the Naked Bible podcast. He's a biblical scholar, and there's a podcast on his website and a link in the channel and on my WordPress site, which there's also a link for here in the channel, that you can get access to and listen to and kind of get to know who I am a little bit, and more so about what the book is about. Okay, so a little bit about me, and then a little bit about the ministry, a little bit more about the ministry, as I've already said a few things, and then about myth and imagination, and we'll call it quits for today. So I'm Professor Mike Jahosky, and I teach humanities here in Florida at St. Petersburg College, and I've been teaching for about 10 years. This will be my 11th year in higher education. I did start teaching as an assistant, like most grad school people in grad school doing humanities. I did a teaching assistant gig in 2008, 9, and 10. So I have been in higher education in some capacity for well over a decade. I've been teaching my own classes since 2010. And my background is in, it's an interdisciplinary background, which means that I was trained in a variety of different fields that overlap, but particularly philosophy, religion. We might also include mythology in that. That's something that I did a lot of focus on, and history. And then I also picked up some of the arts. And for example, I did my master's thesis just due to where I was at the time with some of my interests in the early and high Italian Renaissance and Leonardo da Vinci. So I have some background in the arts and in philosophy, religion, mythology, history. My cultural interests have always been focused on Greco-Roman and biblical cultures, and so Israelite culture, Greece, Rome, and you would also call early modern Italian civilization with the Renaissance. So those are my interests. Sort of my academic background is eclectic. Now in grad school, speaking of grad school, I remember I did a paper for a theory class. I think we were doing just about how to use humanities and as a way of looking at the world. And I did a paper. I don't know if I can remember the title now, but it was a paper where I got to explore some of Tolkien's works, and that was a lot of fun. It was really one of my first big tastes of getting an academic to look at some of my writing about one of my favorite authors, JRR Tolkien, and his books. And though I will tell this story in another video another time, this was one of the many sort of way stations in a journey to write my book, The Good News of the Return of the King. So we'll talk about that in another video. It gives you a little bit of background on me. My wife, Sarah, and I, so I'm married, I've got 2 kids, Lucas and Annabelle. My wife, Sarah, and I have started this lay ministry just so we can have people kind of getting inside our world and seeing what we're doing as a family, but also what I do as a professor and an academic. And we wanted to make it primarily digital. I don't know that this is ever going to grow into something where, it grows and flourishes more, but stay tuned and follow us. You never know what God will do. For now, I'm just really interested in bringing a lot of quality videos, exploring some of the ideas that I talk about in my book, and also what I do and what I love to focus on in the classroom. And probably my favorite subject, as you can tell, I wrote a book about it, has to do with myth. And that is just a completely loaded term. And of course, we're not going to give you a comprehensive breakdown today. I don't even think I'm satisfied with most of my introductions to it in my humanities classes at St. Pete College because I don't have enough time. But I will do what I can here. I just kind of want to explore the concept of mythos with you a little bit, and also what the imagination is and what its role is in understanding and even the telling and retelling of myths. Okay, so the first thing you probably think of, let's face it, when you think of myth is an untrue or a false story. Well, that itself is false. So the Greek term mythos, okay, comes from ancient Greece, and we see this word pop up in Homer, but we also see it pop up in Hesiod and other sources like Plato. I believe also Thucydides and Herodotus mention it as well. These are ancient Greek authors. The word was used in different to mean different things in different contexts, and of course, it did grow to kind of mean what it means today through the influence of Hellenistic philosophy, Epicurean philosophy, especially with its sort of detached worldview, where God is distant and sort of out of touch with his creation, and that myth is not connected to the supernatural, the transcendent realm at all. More of a modern sense, right? A myth is something you don't believe. So even back in the day in ancient Greece, this word already began to kind of take on, and maybe this will be another video we do, myth through history in the future, took on sort of a modern understanding. Okay, myths are lies breathed through silver. C.S. Lewis was reported to have said to JRR Tolkien in 1931. That's not what a myth is. So a mythos, is a Greek word that means an account or a story, like something you give an account for, a story about fact, okay? And this means, of course, that it's going to contain lots of different ideas of truth or expressions of truth, but that truth is not limited to literal truth statements or propositional, rational, straightforward truth statements, okay? Myth is the realm of the imagination. Myth is also the domain of the metaphor, analogy, parable, allegory, etc., simile, so on and so forth, poetry, in other words. And so it's a true while non-literal form or expression of truth about the way things are. Okay, so reality is fact, and truth is statement about fact, or truth is a statement about reality. And so truth is always about something. Of course, here I'm operating as a Christian based on Aristotle's correspondence theory of truth. I think it's the soundest and most true definition of truth. So I'm going with that just to kind of reveal my cards there. And a mythos is a way of knowing about reality through the faculty, which is what the imagination is. It's a faculty. It's something that we can use. It's a part of our human equipment, if you will. It's an imaginative, metaphorical, true while non-literal way of knowing reality. Okay, so already we've kind of dismantled the modern understanding of myth. We think of myth, because it cannot be always rationally, empirically, materially explained and defended, that therefore it's not true, therefore it has nothing of bearing on factuality or reality. That itself is a myth. It's the Enlightenment myth that we find a lot of people living in today, though not everybody. We see that postmodern critical theory is more popular today than modern sort of myth. That, you know, all we need is reason and the senses, and we can investigate the world directly. That reason provides direct access to the world, and that itself is a myth. You're living in a myth, a story about the way things are, and one that is not able to live up to its own standards, I might add. Okay. So I explore this, by the way, in the introduction of my book. So if you do pick up the book, give that a really close read, because I talk about all these sort of ins and outs of things I might have just moved a little fast through, but I really encourage you to check out the book. The introduction is where I lay out a lot of the philosophy. Okay. So myth is really something that can convey truth, but it's something that it's going to take a lot of people getting used to today, because we're used to having the meaning of that word be very different. Okay. And so we usually confine truth to literal, true while literal statements about reality, and anything else is untruth. And so truth is rational, empirical, physical, scientific, and truth and factuality kind of get conflated often with epistemology and metaphysics, and we don't keep that distinction. Epistemology being the study of how we know what is true and real and possible, and metaphysics being the study of what is real and true and possible. And when we confuse those things, it becomes very easy to kind of buy into the Enlightenment, the modern myth that truth is only logos, which is another word I want to talk about for a moment. The true while literal statements, the propositional statements, these things that can be rationally explained and defended and understood, and then scientifically would fall under that as well. And most people, of course, would believe that that would be the only thing we could speak of as true. Well, that's logos. And I'm going to read a quote here from Karen Armstrong in a minute, who I'm not a fan of her theology, but I am a fan of her writing, and she does get in my opinion, a lot of things right. And I really enjoy her books, and I think she's a top-notch scholar. But she talks a lot about these concepts in her book. And so I would recommend some of her books, like The Great Transformation is an excellent book. Logos is sort of a word that's, again, it's got a lot of meaning, but it also too meant an account of things, a true account of the way things are. And so these words kind of really overlapped early on in usage in ancient Greece, but they did drift apart by the time of Plato. for a number of different reasons. But, Greek thought was becoming increasingly more reliant on empirical investigation and rationalism. And so more interest in the physical world kind of led us to drift away from the true while non-literal statements about the way things are. And logos kind of took precedence over mythos. Logos can mean word, it can mean reason, it can mean logic. It's where our word logic comes from, logical. It can mean rationality, having a sort of a rational quality to things. And so it is a loaded term like mythos. Now, when you think of the word mythology in English too, this is interesting. It's a compound of these two words. Mythologos, or mythologio, I believe, is one form of the word. Okay, to give a mythology would be to give kind of a compound account of the way the world works. A mythology, a true mythology, would combine both ways of knowing and speaking about the world, about reality. That would combine both the true while non-literal and the true while literal statements about the way things are. Okay, Alistair McGrath is called for in one of his recent books, Narrative Apologetics, what he quotes another scholar as calling consilience. This is a term that I think was coined by a sociobiologist, Edward O. Wilson. It refers to the ability to weave together, I quote, multiple threads of knowledge in a synthesis, which is able to disclose a more satisfying and empowering view of reality. That's what a real mythology is, okay? When we look at mythology that way, especially that critical mythos concept there, another way that scholars have begun to explore this concept of myth as an account of the way the world works is to look at myth as a worldview that is set in narrative form, or a narrated worldview. A worldview being a mental set of presuppositions and views about the way the world works that of course, covers all the different disciplines from history and psychology to theology, philosophy, economics, and sexuality, and all sorts of things. The worldview is all encompassing. If we look at myth as a narrated worldview, this is an even more appealing way to kind of understand the concept. And that is how, for example, you can understand the allegory of the cave in The Republic by Plato, where he talks about the men chained up in the cave, looking at the shadows on the wall. This is a explanatory story and a propositional view of the way the world works, certain topics and subjects, but set in a narrative form, however thinly disguised in that case, as it becomes clear if you've ever read that story. But it's an excellent story, and it's one that we need to reread and talk about constantly, like all good stories, however short or long. So this is just my crash course, and we're in a little bit over 15 minutes now to mythology, to mythos, and I want to now talk a little bit about the imagination. Before I do that, I'd like to read this excellent quote. Karen Armstrong has a book called A Short History of Myth. I wish I could make it required reading for my kids at school, but I can't at this moment. It's from 2005, and in chapter 1, she says this: in most pre-modern cultures, there were two recognized ways of thinking, speaking, and acquiring knowledge. The Greeks called them mythos and logos. Both were essential. Neither were considered superior to the other. They were not in conflict, but complementary. We've seen that that's not the case really anymore. Each had its own sphere of competence, and it was considered unwise to mix the two. Logos was the pragmatic mode of thought that enabled people to function effectively in the world, that had therefore to correspond accurately to external reality. In popular parlance, a myth, as we've seen, is something that is not true. But in the past, myth was not self-indulgent fantasy. Rather, like logos, it helped people to live effectively in our confusing world, though in a different way from logos. Okay, myths may have told stories about the gods and supernatural, but they were really focused on the more elusive, puzzling, and tragic aspects of the human predicament that lay outside the remit of logos. A myth was something, I love this, that had in some sense happened once, or may have some historical kernel, but also happens all the time. Okay, so as a matter of fact, as I look at this, you can also find some of this same writing in her book, The Case for God, in the introduction, which was published a few years after A Short History of Myth. So it seems like I, at some point, broke into that book as well for this. So both of those books give a fuller treatment of these concepts. I give a pretty in-depth analysis of mythos in the introduction in chapter 1 of my book, The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle Earth. So check that out. And for now, I want to put that aside. We have a lot of things just there in our word for our ministry, Mythic Mission. Right there, there's so much we could explore. And so in the future, I'm going to do a lot of videos on that concept, mythos, and explore some of those things that I might have glossed over in more detail. We said a few minutes ago, maybe do a history of the concept of myth as it's evolved and the perceived meanings of that term have changed throughout human history. That would be a really great topic. I would also love to hear from you if you have any ideas about what you'd like to see covered. But in summation, so far, what I hope you're getting about this ministry is that I want to talk a lot about myth and mythology, which means a lot about literature, philosophy, and religion. And that's what this channel is really going to focus on. Literature is a gateway to another world, another way of inhabiting, a way of inhabiting another world, so that we can, by getting a little farther away from reality, we can understand it better. So kind of comparing reality to what it is not like in order to show what it is more fully like. This is what literature can do. And in my next video, I'm going to record something on indirect communication as a strategy for Christians, but also for non-Christians, just seeking to understand how indirect communication is more effective than direct communication. So we'll be comparing and contrasting that in the next video. And that's what this Mythic Mission ministry is all going to be about. So I hope you'll subscribe and sign up for the great content. So thank you. So let's talk a little bit in closing, and just a little bit, I mean, about the imagination. And here I want to recommend several excellent books. Most recently, Justin Ariel Bailey has written a book called Reimagining Apologetics, The Beauty of Faith in a Secular Age. A little bit further back in 2020, I think it was maybe 2019, Paul Gould wrote a book called Cultural Apologetics, which has a great chapter, I think chapter 4, on the imagination. And I've got a couple others. I just got to pull up my Kindle here, but I think you guys would also enjoy. This is a book from a fellow Whitvenstock published author called Hide and Seek, The Sacred Art of Indirect Communication by Benson P. Fraser. Excellent. Be drawing on that for the next video. Another one would be The Fawn's Bookshelf. If you love myth, you've come to the right place. Charlie Starr has written this book, Charlie W. Starr, The Fawn's Bookshelf, C.S. Lewis on Why Myth Matters. Superb book. Also drawing a lot on that, owe a great debt to his research for the research of my own book. And I think between those 4 or 5 books, you're going to enjoy reading a little bit more about myth on your own, but also about the importance of the imagination in understanding myth. So the imagination, what we should start with more kind of an ancient definition, Aristotle taught was a intermediary between the sense organ and the intellect. That is our seat and availability to use reason. Okay. The great author JRR Tolkien wrote on fairy stories that the imagination is a power to form mental images of things not actually present, but in its highest use, which are indeed not to be found in our primary world at all, or are generally believed not to be found there. Now, I love that last bit because he's talking, of course, about his own work, The Hobbit, which was published just a few years before this essay and speech that he gave, which I believe was 1939, and The Hobbit was 37, if I'm not mistaken. And, he's saying the imagination is the faculty, the ability to picture things that are not real in the primary, the physical, real world, as we say, the world we're incarnated in and that we have a physical presence in. But then he says, or generally believed to not be found there. But in fact, we've experienced and felt something like an orc, Lewis says in his review of The Lord of the Rings. And yet we've never met one. So it's interesting. Tolkien's kind of playing with what is real and what is not there. So we get a sense that the imagination is something that navigates as a go-between between the sense organ, that is our senses, gateway, that we get all this raw material that then feeds it to our imagination, and then our imagination hands it off to our intellect. Now, the great author Michael Ward, a great C.S. Lewis scholar, has written of the imagination this. He says, reason, I quote, depends not only on what we might call the ground floor, which if you imagine a house, imagine the ground floor is the imagination, but also on the basement, which would be the physical sensations and the senses, in order to be supplied with its raw materials. And so we can understand Aristotle's intermediary definition and Gould talks about this in his book, Cultural Apologetics, is the thing that takes the raw materials that are supplied to us through our interaction with the world that we live in, and that which we can picture, of course, that's not in the world, in the primary world, and it then feeds it to the imagination that then sorts through what is true and false and hands it off to the reason, the intellect rather, where our intellect really kind of eventually decides what is true and what is false. And I think it's a wonderful introduction to what the imagination is. But there's something else too. The imagination is the organ of meaning, which is the antecedent of truth or falsehood. Okay, so meaning's opposite is nonsense. And myth is sort of the organ. Imagination is the organ of meaning, and so we have to get a little bit more into this. It's a little bit of a deeper subject. In a future video, we'll talk a little bit more about this and take a deeper dive. But so far, I think you have an understanding of what mythos is and what the imagination is. There might be just a few more things we can squeeze in here. Just to kind of summarize, and then look forward to a future video where we take a little bit of a deeper dive into what the imagination does and how it's connected to meaning and truth and reality, and of course, myth, which is extremely important for our purposes here at Mythic Mission. So Charlie Starr writes that the imagination provides meanings that make it possible for reason to find truths. So this is what Lewis meant by the imagination is the organ of meaning, right? So meaning is something that needs to be there in order for something to have truth or falsehood. It can't be nonsense, or we can't even consider whether it's true or false. And so the imagination, it just so happens, as we've learned today, has a really important role in human thinking. And we need to take a deeper look at this. The imagination can be fooled. It can also be used for evil purposes. But it can also be used to persuade indirectly and to picture things and to deepen and broaden our understanding of reality. So it can go both ways. And it's very important we investigate this more. And I'm looking forward to it in our next video. For now, thank you. I hope you'll subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the WordPress, check out the reviews on my book, check out it on Amazon, Whitfenstock, which is my publisher. And I look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you for listening.